for that warm welcome. You'll have to yell at me if I move the microphone away or you can't hear me at any time. But thank you so much for coming, and I love to see this packed house. So as Mark mentioned, I'm an e-learning and curriculum specialist, which you might think, well, this picture doesn't really look like what that sounds like. And that's because this is something that I also work on that came out of my doctoral research. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. But she also asked that I tell you a little bit about what it means to be an e-learning and curriculum specialist. So I work at the Center for Teaching and Learning, and there we help to further the mission for teaching and learning at Western. So we run workshops for professors, we help them one-on-one with anything that they might want to do to improve their teaching, and for our grad students as well. So that's what I do, but not here. So this is one of the lakes that I study, and you can just have a look at it and think about what looks different from that lake to the lakes that you might be used to seeing in southwestern Ontario. But let's start first just by talking about water. So Earth is the blue planet. You might have heard that before. 70% covered in water. But a very small percentage of that, only 3%, is fresh water. An even smaller amount, 0.5%, is fresh water in liquid form. So 0.5% of the water on Earth is fresh water in liquid form. An even smaller amount are what's found in the lakes and the rivers, 0.009% of surface fresh water, which is amazing when you think about it. This is most of the water that we rely upon for our drinking and other uses. This is also the water that carves a lot of the landscapes that you see, especially in southwestern Ontario, but other regions of the world as well. So all the action that forms, for example, the Medway River Valley or the Grand Canyon, all of that is from this tiny fraction of surface fresh water. So this amount of water on Earth it's not going anywhere, but the quality of it, unfortunately, is degrading. And that's a little bit what I'm going to talk about today. Now, I thought this is one thing, but I just want to look at it one other way just to show you the water that's on Earth. So that large sphere you see up at the top here, well, not that large compared to the size of the Earth, that's all of the water in and above Earth's surface, including ice. Now, this tiny little sphere, which is still pretty big amount of water, is all the liquid fresh water on Earth. You might actually have a hard time seeing the fresh water in lakes and rivers. It looks like a tiny speck. That's all of the fresh water in lakes and rivers. And if you look at it, oh, it looks like it could even fit in Lake Erie, and it could. But it's 50 kilometers high, and so when you stretch that little sphere out, that fills all of the lakes and rivers on Earth's surface. So it's a seemingly tiny amount, but very important. Now I'm going to give away my punchline. The greatest threat to lakes is eutrophication. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what that is, but that's the greatest threat to lakes. Does anyone know what lake this is? This is part of a lake. Yeah, exactly. This is Lake Erie from last September. And this is a true color image, which means it's a picture taken from a satellite with no tricks done to it at all. So that green is algae. And this kind of algae, some of the algae that's in there actually produces toxins, and there were some water quality issues that resulted. So it's yucky, that's the scientific word, but it also has some real problems. We can zoom in on this picture. You can see in the bottom right here, there's a ship, so it shows you just the scale of these algae blooms. And this is what I'm going to be talking about today, eutrophication. So this isn't something that's brand new. There's been lots in the news from parts of Ontario and all over the world about eutrophication in cottage country, in Ontario, in lakes that we wouldn't expect it to be happening in. It's a problem that we've known about since the 70s. So what is eutrophication? I keep using that word. It's excess nutrients, too many nutrients, in aquatic systems and the ecosystem response. So the nutrients that we're talking about are nitrogen and phosphorus. So these are things that living organisms need, but eutrophication is talking about having too much. too much of them. Okay, so what can cause these excess nutrients? So there's a couple of main kind of categories of things that can cause excess nutrients. The first is natural. So this process does happen naturally. So one of the things that can increase nutrients is dung or poo. So animals using the bathroom or using the lake as their bathroom over time increases the amount of nutrients in the lake. But we're talking about over the course of thousands of years. So the natural life cycle of a lake is to get more nutrients, more eutrophic over time, but it takes a really long time. The other possibility is human-caused eutrophication. So an increase in, for example, livestock and the manure that they produce. All of that reaches the river systems and eventually reaches the lake. Industries can produce nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, so their runoff can increase nutrients in the lake. Fossil fuel combustion, so from cars and industry, produces nitrogen, and that can make its way to lakes, and sewage as well. So a number of different factors that can increase eutrophication. So the second part of the definition is the ecosystem response. So it's both, eutrophication is describing both the cause and the effect. So the ecosystem response could be increase in algae. I talked about that one already. So algae, these are tiny microscopic organisms. They're growing really quickly, and they're reproducing a lot of them. You can also have an increase in aquatic plants, so kind of like seaweed. You can have a decrease in the oxygen in the water. So when you have a lot of living things, you also get a lot of dead things, right? So when they die, they decay and they use up oxygen, and that leads to a decrease in oxygen. That can further lead to something called fish kills, where you get a lot of fish at once dying in a lake because they don't have enough oxygen. You can get a decrease in biodiversity, which might seem counterintuitive because you're getting a huge increase in life in the lake with many, many algae, but only a few select species of algae really benefit, and the number of species overall goes down. And this can all lead to problems of taste and odor and even toxicity of, for example, drinking water. And it just doesn't look too good either. Okay, so another thing to note just before I move on to telling you a little bit more about what I did and what I found is to let you know that we can be talking about really small quantities of nitrogen and phosphorus. So we measure nitrogen and phosphorus in parts per billion, which is about 1/4 of a teaspoon in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. So if you have 10 parts per billion, adding just a few more teaspoons of nitrogen or phosphorus to this Olympic-sized swimming pool can have an effect. So it's relatively small, seems like relatively small amounts. Okay, so why should we protect lakes? Well, I already told you there's not that much surface fresh water on the planet in the first place, but there's some other reasons too. So they're important ecosystems. So the lakes themselves are important ecosystems, but they also support ecosystems on land as well. They're a source of fresh water for humans. So agriculture, industry, and drinking water and the water that we use mostly comes from surface water. They can be an important source of food in certain areas in the form of fish. They're used for transportation and shipping. And they're places of recreation. They're also just places of local identity. So thinking about Lake Erie and Lake Huron, for example, anyone who grew up around here might be used to going there to the beach, and it's a kind of a part of our identity that we can go there and go for a swim without worrying. So I've talked a little bit about Lake Erie, but that's not where I studied. So why would we study eutrophication in mountain lakes? So some of the answers are really similar. They're important ecosystems. In fact, they're known for having really high biodiversity, mountain lake systems are. They're also important for human use. Even though we don't see any people in this picture in the background, these are the headwaters or the sources of water for populations that live downstream. So ultimately, in areas near the mountains that I worked at, the water comes from the mountains ultimately. and they're also places of recreation. So some similar answers. There's one different answer that I would add as well, and that's that they're bellwethers of change. So because there are fewer impacts, like there's not a power plant right nearby, there's not people driving their cars right nearby, there's not sewage seeping into the site, because of all of that, they can be a predictor of change because we have fewer impacts on the sites themselves. So what are some of the things that could impact mountain lakes? So they could be affected by local activities. I said the local activities are fewer. These are activities right within the lake's catchment basin itself. But there are some like recreation, fish stocking, so adding fish to the lake that weren't there before, and free-range grazing. So that's when farmers bring up cattle or sheep into the mountains, leave them for the season, and then come back at the end and grab them again. I think it's that simple, but I don't really know. But I did see cattle and sheep up there, so I'm sure it's not that simple. There's also regional and global activities like climate warming and atmospheric pollution that can impact these sites. So what nutrients are important to eutrophication in mountain lakes? So I mentioned 2 nutrients before. Does anyone remember what they were? Yes. Okay, so it sounds like an easy question, but it's actually kind of complicated in mountain lakes because around here we're mostly worried about phosphorus. That's the big one. Mountain lakes are special in the fact that nitrogen can also be an important nutrient for eutrophication. So can phosphorus, and sometimes both are really important. That's called co-limitation. So whatever is the limiting nutrient is the important nutrient in alpine lakes. It makes it a little bit more complicated to try and figure out what's going on. So limiting nutrient, maybe some have not heard of this before. So obviously I turned to bikes. That's the most logical thing to go to. So what are limiting nutrients? Well, if I have all of these bike parts, how many bikes can I make? Anyone want to wager a guess? Anyone a bike technician? How many can I make? How many total fully formed bikes can I make? Oh, somebody says a piece is missing, and my students said the same thing. Some say 0. I'm going to say, I've heard 3 a few times. 0. Why 0? No handlebars. Okay, so my students pointed out that there was no seat, and I fixed that, but I did not fix the handlebars. Okay, pretending that there are handlebars there, we can make 3 bikes. And you're all very sharp, and I so appreciate it. Okay, so we can make about 3 bikes, not including the handlebars, because frames are limiting here. It doesn't matter how many more wheels that you add, you still only have 3 frames. So frames are the limiting nutrient in this strange lake with bikes in it. Where's the handlebars? It's so obvious to me now. Okay, so if phosphorus are the wheels and nitrogen is the frames, doesn't matter how many more wheels we add, we still can't make more bikes. Or we still can't make more algae. Okay, so if we have a situation like this, and all of a sudden we add a bunch more nitrogen, a bunch more bike frames, now we can go into production really quickly, make a ton of bikes, make a ton of algae, and get an algae bloom. That's the idea behind a limiting nutrient. So everything else that algae needs to grow is there. There's just one thing that's holding it back, and if you add that one thing, then you get an algae bloom. So let's look at some of the causes of eutrophication in mountain environments. So as I said, nitrogen and phosphorus are the key to increasing algae and causing eutrophication in mountain environments. So one of the things that can lead to increased eutrophication or increased nitrogen and phosphorus is atmospheric deposition. This just means nitrogen and phosphorus that arrives through the atmosphere. It might be dry, it might be in rain, but it's arriving through the atmosphere. This can come from fossil fuel burning, which adds nitrogen. It can come from agricultural dust, which can add nitrogen or phosphorus, or phosphate mining, which can add phosphorus. You can have local impacts like grazing. So I mentioned the impact of manure. This can increase phosphorus in the lakes. Fish stocking. So lakes in the western US typically would not have had any fish. But in around the 50s and 60s, folks thought a healthy lake has fish, so they added fish to most lakes of the western US. So that actually adds a bunch of organic material, the fish themselves, and then also their dung or manure is also organic matter. So that can increase nutrients to the sites. Finally, we have the impact of warming. So warming doesn't actually directly increase the amount of nitrogen or phosphorus to the lakes, but it can cause algae to grow faster. And so it can actually be a factor in eutrophication at times as well. Add to this that alpine lakes have a lot of special characteristics that make them more susceptible to eutrophication. So some things like having really thin soils in their catchments, not a lot of vegetation, things that would typically take up nitrogen and phosphorus on the way to the lakes, just aren't doing that kind of same type of job. They also get a lot more rain, and they have hydrology. The water cycle there is dominated by snow melt. So all at once you get rushing in of water at spring melt, and that adds a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus all at once. And the terrestrial system, the land around, can't take it up quickly enough. Okay, so I'm going to rename this slide actually and call it the suspects. So these are what we're looking at, what we were researching to try and figure out what is causing eutrophication in mountain lakes. So I went to my desk, which looks like this. I got out my pamphlet with the suspects, and I asked the question, what is causing eutrophication in mountain lakes? There's actually a pine cone on this desk, which is a very important tool. My study area is the Uinta Mountains in Utah, USA. So in the western United States. This is a picture of them here in July. They're about 200 kilometers from east to west. And they're special because they're the only east-west trending mountain range in North America. So they're kind of plopped in the middle of a desert-like region, but here, because of the amount of increased precipitation that you get in mountains, they're not so much desert-like as the area surrounding. This is a picture from July as well, so you can get snow in the middle of July, which you just hope is not during your field season, but you can never be sure. Okay, that's the field site. This is my desk again. That's because there's one more thing that I need to tell you, and that's the catch. The catch is that in a remote site like this, we lack measurements or long-term data. So we want to figure out how things have been changing over time, but we can't do that if we don't have long-term monitoring data, measurements of how algae or how nutrients have changed over time. Because it's hard to get up there to take samples. I know that, actually. It's kind of hard to get up there. So we turn to some different tools. And Mark mentioned that I use paleolimnology as my science. That's what we do. We investigate using paleolimnology. So paleo means old, and limnology means lakes or surface waters. So this is a study of lake sediments to figure out how environments have changed over time. To give you a kind of a picture of how this works, this is a concept kind of diagram of what a lake looks like. You can see the lake itself is shaped kind of like a little bowl, and in the bottom you have sediments accumulating. We take samples of those sediments to try and figure out how the environment has changed over time. So on this diagram here, you can have things that add to the sediments from the water column itself, so dead organisms. You can have things that wash in off of the land, and you can have things that come in from the atmosphere. And all of those come together to form the lake sediment record, and it just stays down there undisturbed. The water over top protects it. And so we can get really nice records over time that can tell us about environmental change. So how does this actually work? So I brought a prop. How many people bring a screwdriver? I did. I'm gonna show you and shout, and then if you didn't hear it, then you can let me know. light here. Okay, so what I have is a lake sediment core on a long rope. And usually this is in a dinghy, so this is actually easier. But what we do is we attach a clear plastic tube, and this is the small one. It's probably 20 pounds. This is the small one, the small core. That one in the picture is much bigger. So we take this sediment core, and we lower it, usually with 2 people, but look at me go. We lower it off the side of the boat into the sediment. Okay, now we have this metal thing. And this is way deeper. It's going to be at the bottom of the lake in the center, the deepest part of the lake. And I'm going to drop it down. Okay. Now what you maybe didn't see there is that there's a plug. Woo! Don't tell the faculty of that. Okay. There's a plug here that just closed into the top of the coring tube. So now when I pull it up, and this is not supposed to be in the bottom, but I maybe can't get it out right now. When I pull it up, there's a vacuum. So it pulls up the sediment with it. And as long as I don't pull it above the water, the sediment won't all come gushing out. So then my partner in crime up there puts a plug in the bottom of the sediment core, takes it into the boat, and holds it like this till we get back to shore. So that's a picture of us coring. The first step that's not on there is that you need to carry this stuff to the top of the mountain. So we take a lake sediment core, then we have a look at it like this person in the picture is doing here, and we make sure the top is completely undisturbed, because that represents present day, and to know that we have a good core, that has to be undisturbed. Then right in the field on the shore, in picture 3 here, we have this device that just pushes the sediment up from the bottom, and section by section, centimeter by centimeter, we put parts of the mud into little bags because it's kind of soupy. So we can't just bring the core back like this on an airplane. So we put it into little bags, and we bring those back to the lab. So those little bags of sediment are like pages in a book, and that's what we analyze back in the lab. This is a blown up picture of one of our sediment cores. You can see that the top is undisturbed, that's present day. And then the farther down you go, the older the record is. It's probably the coolest mud you've ever seen. Okay, so we have to do a lot of different things. This is called a multi-proxy study, which just means we look at a lot of different measurements and fossils and things like that within the core to try to get a more complete picture of what's happening. One of the most important things that we can do is date the core. So we know the present is at the top, and we know it gets older as you go down, but we don't necessarily know what all those dates are. So we use radioactive isotopes to date the cores. We burn some of the sediment to look at the percentage of organic, or what used to be living matter, in the cores. We look at chlorophyll A, which for these sites is a good indicator of how much algae. You might have heard of chlorophyll because it's what makes plants green, algae as well. We look at isotopes, and we also look at fossil diatoms, which are a type of algae. So here, for example, are some diatoms. These diatoms have a skeleton that's basically made of glass. It's glass that an organism has been able to make. And so even after they die, they stay intact, and we can look at them through a microscope. So on the left, you see a bunch of different kinds of diatoms that we can identify by sight under the microscope, and certain ones like to live in certain kinds of environments. It's very similar to the kind of science that's used to tell what the environment was like when dinosaurs were around. They look at the plants, and they can tell what kind of environment a plant would like. We can tell what kind of environment a diatom would like. So they have very specific environmental preferences. So paleolimnology, have I sold you on it yet? It's very cool. It provides a historical perspective. It provides a baseline of pre-disturbance conditions. So if we want to know if eutrophication has happened at these sites, we first have to know what the site was like before. It gives us long-term, decades to millennial trends. And it gives us a comparison of known historic events to determine the cause of change. And that's what I did in this study. So this is an example of two of the lakes in my study. You can see them up here and the cores that went with them. Again, just looking at them, like your first reaction about how these can be similar or different from lakes that you've seen, for example, at the Westminster Ponds in London. So coming back to the suspects, we're going to go through them one by one and see what paleolimnology told us about those sites. So let's start with warming. Okay, so I'm going to show you a little bit of data, but then I'm going to sum it all up each time to tell you what we determined from this data. So you might be used to graphs showing you time along the bottom or the x-axis. We flip it because we're thinking about lake sediment cores where present is at the top. So here we have 2010 going down to 1890. The cores are actually way older than this. This is just the top. The cores can show us up to 800 years for just a core that fits in that tube. So the x-axis is time, so old, 1890 at the bottom to 2010 at the top. And the that's the y. The x-axis is chlorophyll A, which is an indicator of how much algae. So if we look at just the last 100 years and all of these are for 6 different lakes, 5 out of 6 of them show an increase in that algae starting around 1950. And that's kind of the main, most drastic change that we see in algae. So if we compare that to the temperature record for the region, and the western US and alpine environments are warming faster than the rest of North America other than the Arctic, we see that the actual increase in temperature for this region, which is common for the western US, isn't until about 1985. So local warming starts in around 1985. This is after the change we see in chlorophyll A. So warming can't be the triggering effect for the changes that we see because the changes happened first. So warming in the Uinta Mountains starts after eutrophication begins, so we know that warming cannot be the culprit. Next, we look at a local factor, grazing. So here again, here are 4 of my sites. I'm not going to show all of them because the data is similar for these 4 sites, but I just like to show some pictures of this beautiful area. So grazing in the Uinta Mountains, this area, began in 1890, perhaps a little bit earlier. By 1930, there were sheep and cattle everywhere. So it wasn't very well managed, and people were they just had tons and tons of animals up there in the Uinta Mountains. So the peak is in 1930. It's become better managed since over time, so gradually, and then by 1990, at the 2 sites that I'll show you, no more grazing was allowed in those catchments. But there are still a lot of areas where grazing is allowed in the Uintas. So at these 2 sites, no grazing is allowed since 1990. Is there a Denise in the house? This lake is named for you. So this is Denise Lake and Taylor Lake. And you can see again this chlorophyll A record on the left is algae. This one I just shaded in green. That shows you an increase starting in 1950 in algae at both of these sites. So the eutrophication effect. Percent organics tell us a similar story. So this is just things that used to be living. So an increase around 1950. And this doesn't match the story of grazing. So that peaked in 1930 and has slowly become less intense over time. So we would expect to see either a spike in algae at that time because of all the extra manure, or perhaps a spike of inorganic matter because of extra erosion. But we don't see that. It actually looks like it doesn't hardly respond at all in 1930. So grazing peaks in 1930 with seemingly no effect on eutrophication. Let's look at fish stocking. So before 1950, there would have been no fish in these sites at all. And even to this day, they still add fish to the sites. The fish don't survive on their own. They need to be continually replenished. In 1950, fish stocking occurred by horseback, so it's not certain whether these lakes would have been stocked at that time because they're pretty high up there. They're above 3,000 meters above sea level. I carried a lot of stuff up there. I'm not sure how likely people would have wanted to bring fish, tiny fish, all that way. But you never know. By 1960 on and to today, fish stocking occurs by air. So a plane flies over and drops, I can't remember what baby fish are called. I want to say fingerlings, but that's potatoes. So they drop tiny fish into the lakes, and they've been doing this. We have records of them doing this at all 6 of the lakes that we've studied. So the timing is actually not bad for fish stocking to be the culprit here. So we know that eutrophication increased around 1950. We also know that fish stocking became more intense after 1950 as well. So the timing checks out. Now I'm going to add another proxy or measurement to this picture, which is nitrogen isotopes, which is the blue line here. So nitrogen isotopes, you can see they decrease towards present. I'm not going to worry you too much about what they mean, but we use nitrogen isotopes to tell us kind of like a fingerprint or a signature of a source. So the literature tells us that with fish stocking, this value should increase over time, but what we in fact see is the opposite. It decreases over time. So the timing of fish stocking checks out. It coincides with eutrophication, but nitrogen isotopes tells us it's not the fish. My dad's a mystery novel writer, but I am not, so I just left the one that is the culprit to the end. Maybe you got ahead of me on that one, but let's look at the evidence for atmospheric deposition of nitrogen and phosphorus. So what's happening over time that we can compare to these records? Well, let's look at nitrogen. So fertilizer nitrogen and nitrogen from fossil fuel combustion increases rapidly after 1950. So the lakes that I studied are downwind of Salt Lake City, which is a rapidly growing metropolis. And that population has increased drastically since 1950, which comes with an increase in fossil fuel combustion as well. At the same time, fertilizer use has increased in this area as agriculture has intensified, and fertilizer can add nitrogen as well. So this is fertilizer use in the Wasatch Front, which is the region nearby my lakes. Similar story with phosphorus. So fertilizer phosphorus and mining phosphorus increased rapidly after 1950. So this is fertilizer use in the Wasatch Front increasing after 1950, and the production of phosphate in the US showing to increase after 1950 as well. So fertilizer use, fossil fuel combustion, and mining all increased rapidly after 1950. This matches well with our chlorophyll A, our algae record. What do the nitrogen isotopes say about that? Well, we would expect with nitrogen fertilizer and fossil fuels that nitrogen 15 should decrease. So this isotope value should decrease towards the top of the core. And that's what we see. So it's decreasing going into the more negative at the top of the core. We can actually add more and more proxies to support this story, measurements. I'll give you one more example. This is Asterianella formosa, which is a beautiful name for a diatom. So this is a type of algae that we can see under the microscope. So we look at all of the kinds of algae that we see. I'm just picking out one here because Asterianella formosa loves nitrogen. We know that about its properties. It loves nitrogen. And you can see at Taylor Lake, it increases at about the same time as we get the increase in algae overall. Now, Denise Lake has a small increase. It goes from 0 to 3 or 4%, which doesn't sound like much, but Denise Lake is only 2 meters deep. We wouldn't expect to see this particular diatom there. So the fact that it shows up at all tells us there's likely to be more nitrogen at these sites. So atmospheric deposition is the best answer that we have for causing eutrophication at these sites in the Uinta Mountains. So it's too much of an essential nutrient, reactive nitrogen. So there's a lot of nitrogen in the air. We humans can't use most of the nitrogen that's in the air. It has to be in a form that we can use, and we get it through our food. Certain organisms, like some kinds of algae and some kinds of fungus or bacteria that live in a relationship with fungus, they can make the kind of nitrogen that we need, but we can't do it. So over time, as organisms have evolved, nitrogen has typically been low because only certain things can make it. So everything around you that you see has evolved under low nitrogen conditions, which means when you add it, they're able to grow really quickly. So humans have wreaked havoc basically on the nitrogen cycle. So of the total reactive nitrogen in a year, which is 413 teragrams, which is, each teragram is 1 billion kilograms. So of the total reactive nitrogen, over half of it is human-caused or anthropogenic, so added to the system by us. So by fossil fuel combustion, by fertilizers that we add, and by the types of crops that we produce. So what causes eutrophication in mountain lakes? So the culprits are nitrogen from fertilizer use and fossil fuel combustion, and phosphorus, so phosphate dust from agricultural intensification and mining. And these are arriving through the atmosphere. So lake sediment evidence says the culprit is nitrogen and phosphorus, but the nitrogen isotope record isn't perfect. It has its limitations. So for example, I talked about how the source value will decrease if there's fertilizer present. There are other sources that might cause nitrogen isotope value to decrease as well. There's also changes that can happen in the lake that can change this record, so it's not the perfect alibi. So we had to strengthen our case using limnology. So if paleolimnology is the study of old lakes, limnology is just the study of lakes. So we went up into the mountains, we took into the same sites, we took samples from different parts of the lake, the little rivers that lead to the lake, the snow, and we took them back to the lab and looked at isotopes of one of those biologically available forms of nitrogen called nitrates in the water. And then we use a model to actually figure out how much of this nitrate comes from different sources. Just so we can know a little bit, we can add this to the story from paleolimnology. If we can know where is that nitrate coming from, we can say, okay, it makes sense that nitrogen was increasing at these sites. So nitrate that I've been talking about is one form of reactive nitrogen, one of those forms that organisms like algae can use. So isotopes are elements like nitrogen that have the same chemical properties. So a nitrogen is a nitrogen is a nitrogen, but its mass is a little bit different. And that makes it behave just slightly differently so that we can tell the difference between sources. So nitrate is made up of 1 nitrogen and 3 oxygens. If we look at the isotopes of oxygen, shown here, oxygen has a mass of 16 usually. 99% of the oxygen that we breathe is oxygen 16. But a tiny fraction is oxygen 18 or oxygen 17. And likewise for nitrogen 15, almost all of the nitrogen that we breathe is nitrogen 14, but a little bit is nitrogen 15. This doesn't matter too much except to know that this is the general picture for Earth, but different sources have slightly different percentages. So different places where this nitrate can come from have slightly different percentages. And that acts like a fingerprint or a signature. So this is a graph that's showing those isotopes on 2 axes, and all that really matters, all that I want you to take from this is that nitrate that comes from the atmosphere will plot up here. Nitrate that comes from the land surface is going to plot at 0. Not above 0, not slightly above 0, at 0. This helps us separate nitrate that comes from the atmosphere and nitrate that comes from the land system. Okay? Add to that that nitrogen that comes from the land system can come from some slightly different places here. So manure, fertilizer, or soil. So when we plot our samples, we see that the snow and the snowmelt plots near the atmosphere. That makes sense because the last time I checked, snow came from the atmosphere. So that makes sense, and our method is working. Inflows and lakes plot closer to the land surface, but slightly above. And anything that's above 0 has some influence from the atmosphere. Now we can have a look at the different sources here and put it into a mathematical model that helps us tell us how much nitrate is coming from these different sources. So I'm going to jump right to the results of that model and show you that most, 70% of the nitrates in the Uinta mountain lakes that I studied are from human causes, 70% of those nitrates. So 62% come from atmospheric delivered fertilizer, 10% come from fossil fuel combustion, and the remaining come from other atmospheric sources, soil, and a tiny bit from manure. So this corroborates our story from Limnology that atmospheric nitrate or nitrogen is impacting these sites. So far we know that increased nitrogen has caused increased algae growth in the last 60 years. Increased nitrates in the Uinta Mountains are human-caused, over 70%, mostly from agriculture and arriving through the atmosphere. Phosphorus may also have a role, and it could become limiting as nitrogen increases because alpine systems have that special possibility of being co-limited. So in conclusion, paleolimnology is awesome, and it can be used to provide information about the causes of eutrophication. So we put a bunch of different measurements, proxies together to tell the story of environmental change at these lakes over time. This knowledge can be used to help develop effective lake ecosystem management plans, but it is truly a challenge because the sources are distant and they're geographically spread. So you can't pinpoint them to a single industry or a single source. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much and also thank my PhD supervisor and other collaborators and the U.S. Forest Service who worked with us to collect samples. Thank you very much.